Welcome back. We're at lesson 6 for the AQS Let's Quilt Beginner series with Bonnie, and this is our Appliqué and Ruching class. So I'm going to just do a little bit of review from yesterday because you can see that I have all of the shark's teeth put on the edge of my quilt block. And I thought you might want to know, how do you know how far you keep folding your paper? Well, I'll show you an easy way to test it. If I had folded my paper 3 times, I've just cut my paper on the fold, and so I could lay that on the edge of my quilt, and you could see that that's really way too big, isn't it? It's actually about the size of what we have on the quilt, the red and white quilt. So I kept folding, and so now you can see that I folded my paper and I put that on my quilt, and that looks like it's better scale, a smaller one for a smaller quilt. So that's an easy way for you to be able to test it to see exactly which size you prefer on your quilt. If you were doing 4 blocks, the bigger size would probably be better. Okay, and I hope that you found that pretty easy of using this for your measuring stick, because we really didn't have to do any math once we got our fabric strips cut, did we? All right, now, so one thing that I did when I sewed my shark's teeth on the edge, I decided that I was going to cut off the last, and here they are, I just cut them right off. So that I could make the corner so that it would be really pretty. And you can see sometimes it doesn't line up, sometimes the fabric doesn't match very well. So I cut a 3-inch square. It really didn't have to be that big, but you always want to overcut it so you don't have to go cut another one. And I laid it right where, right above where my stitching line is. Now I will tell you, this is a great place for you to use a glue stick. I had to rip 2 of these out because my fabric moved just a little bit on me. And so I learned the hard way. Put a little glue underneath this half square and it'll stay right where you need it. You can pin it in place. And then I sewed it from the back side of the quilt so that I could do my, not quite 1/4 of an inch. You want to be inside that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I did that both directions, and then I went in and trimmed the corner out. It's a good way too, at that point, to make sure that your corners are good and square. And so I just used this little ruler and laid it in here, and I was able, and I did have just a little bit that I trimmed off to make sure that that corner was square both directions. Okay, let's talk then about what size do we make this outside border, and it depends on what size your quilt block is. I go by the method that I try to use a dimension that's close to something that's divisible in the number. You know, my block, I trimmed it to 18 inches, and so 18 inches divided by 9, I ended up with 2. 18 inches divided by 3 would be 6. 4 would be, don't want to use 4. You might have to use 4.5. At any rate, so I made the first border 2 inches, and then to keep that in scale with my outside border, I made it 4 inches. The red and white quilt with all 4 blocks, I made the border on it 5 inches. So we're going to have just a short word from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to figure out exactly what size we have to cut our strips to be able to put our borders on our quilt.
The secret to every great project is great lighting. You can have beautiful fabric, the best threads, but if you can't see what you are sewing, we all know what will happen. Vivilux lights and lasers are the only lights made by quilters for quilters. Look for Vivilux lights and lasers at your favorite independent sewing and quilt shop or online.
I'm Amanda Murphy, and I'm a quilt and pattern designer. The Bernina Q16 is quilting magic. One of the hallmarks of a great quilting experience is when you lose yourself in your work.
Bernina, made to create.
Okay, let's decide what size we need to cut these borders. All right, I've already decided that my finished border is going to be 4 inches. And so now I need to measure across from one edge of my center of my quilt to the other edge. And on my quilt, that was 22.5 inches. Well, now when we try to calculate the borders, we're going to get rid of any seam allowances that we have in here. So my first number in the formula, and that is the width of the quilt, is 22. All right, now I have to add on 2 times the width of my border. So on one side I have 4 inches, the other side I have 4 inches. So I'm going to add on 8 inches. And lastly, we will add on 1 inch for seam allowance. And this is just, it's a little bit of a fudge factor in there. Normally, if you were doing a half square triangle, you would add on 7/8 of an inch. We're just going to add an inch, and then you're never going to be too short. So we're going to cut 4 pieces. Mine were cut 4.5 inches wide by 31 inches long. Now, how did I cut those? You know, sometimes it's not fun to cut something that's longer than your cutting mat. So I just left my strips cut in half, and I divided 31 in half and lined up my ruler on 15.5 inches and cut it off. And so then I had a few inches that I just cut off over here. That's a real easy way. The other thing that you want to do is that you want to put a pin in the center of each of those borders. If you do that now, you'll have it all ready to go as you're ready to sew them on. The same thing with our quilt. We're going to fold it in half, and you can see here on this side, I only have 1 border to sew on, but I did this on all 4 sides. And so I have my pin here ready for the last border to be sewn on. So I cut my borders 4.5 inches by 31 inches, and you need 4 of them. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to pin that together. If you haven't printed out your downloadables, the downloadables for today are 2 pages, and it has that formula right on there, so you can write on. I wrote it on a sticky note, but you can write right on your paper and just fill in those blanks. However, whatever size you decide you want to make the width of your border, times 2 plus the finished width of the center plus 1 inch for the border, or 1 inch for the seam allowance, and you're all set to go. Okay, so now let's pin this on. Now when I sew this, I like to sew from the quilt. I'm going to lay the border underneath, and I'm going to line up these 2 pins. Oops, I'm about losing my pin here. I'm going to line up these 2 pins. And so now I'm going to work first to one corner and the other corner. But one of the things I'm going to do before I do that is I need to mark. You remember when we sewed on this floater border, we started 1/4 of an inch from the end and we ended 1/4 of an inch from the end. And so I'm just going to take my ruler and I'm going to mark that. Get it in both directions. Okay, there's that one. And here's that one. Just make sure you can see that really well. And I'll do the same thing with this other corner. All right, so you can see, I can see that pretty well now. Okay, now we're going to continue pinning, and I like to sew from the quilt side just because you can make sure that you're catching everything. And I'm going to just align this, and I'm going to pull it, but I'm not going to stretch it. And we'll put a few pins in here just to hold it, to get it to the sewing machine. Now, when I get over here to the corner, I like to put a pin right here. Let's see if I make sure I get this all lined up straight here. Let's see it better this way. I like to put a pin in that seam allowance, and now this will do two things. Number one, it will keep your border that you already have sewn on out of your way, but it also lets you see right exactly where you need to start when you take it to the sewing machine. So that's half of it. So now let's finish pinning the other half. One of the reasons that I add that fudge factor, and I can tell you that this brown fabric is stretchy and ravelly. You know, all fabric isn't created equal. And sometimes when it sews together, it will sew together different. If you were sewing with all batiks, you'd have a good hard surface. But this is a woven fabric, and because of that, it makes it so it's a little bit wobbly, and it does sew in different. Okay, I'm at the other end, and so I'm going to put this right here in the seam allowance. And now I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine, and I'll get ready to sew this on, and we're going to take just a break from our sponsors, and we'll be right back, and we'll sew this border to the quilt.
Whether you're doing applique by hand or by machine, couching or ruching, YLI has the products to support your creativity. For needle turn applique, choose YLI Silk 100. It's so fine it just disappears into the fabric, and nothing feels like silk. Ask your local independent quilt shop or check out our website at ylicorp.com.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do as I get ready to sew this is I'm going to use my flywheel on my sewing machine, and I'm just going to turn that toward me so that I can set that needle exactly where I need it to be. So once I've done that, now I can take my 1/4 of an inch seam, and we're ready to go. Now as I approach this end of it now, I need to stop a 1/4 of an inch in, so I'm going to slow my machine down so that I hit it right where I need to. One more stitch. And I'm going to do a little back stitch, a couple stitches, and cut my thread. Okay, so now the next thing I need to do is set my seam. You know, we do that, we really need to do that every time we sew a seam, is set that seam in there. We'll just let the steam of the iron do its work. And now I'm going to press that seam allowance so it goes out toward the border. Now I'm just going to press so that I make sure that my ends, both directions, are nice and flat. And now we're ready to mark our miter. So now you'll remember when we sewed on the floating border that we used our 45-degree angle on our ruler, and we're going to lay that on the seam line. And then sometimes it's real easy to get confused, and you might end up with your angle going this way instead of toward the corner. So you just need to make sure you flip your ruler around until you get that line and the ruler's face toward the corner. Now I like to just highlight that spot where the seams start and stop, because that's the point that I need to have this end of the 45-degree line, and I'm going to line it up on the seam allowance. And again, the reason we do that is if you haven't been extremely accurate with your seam line, it will make the edge of your border not completely straight. So whatever you've sewn, you already know is as straight as it's going to get. So that's why we do the line based off of the seam allowance here. And I like to just take my pencil. All right, and so I'm on the seam line. Now the one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to scrub with your pencil. You're drawing this line on the bias, and it's real easy to be able to stretch this fabric. So I'm just going to, if I have to go over it twice, I'll just pick up the pen and go over it twice. And my ruler isn't quite long enough. And you could use your long ruler to do this, but for demonstration purposes, it really is easier for me to just slide the ruler down and complete the line. And I'll put my pencil right on that line, line it up, and finish drawing. Okay, so that's the first angle. Now we're going to reverse these two pieces and get them laid out nice and flat. And now you always have the ruler right side up for one side and wrong side up for the other side. I had it upside down for that one, and so now you can see that I'm going to put it, the 45-degree line, I can read it right side up on this ruler now. We have it all marked. And so now it's a little easier this time to align these edges. For one thing, our border is bigger, but we also can take the seam allowance of that previous border, and you're going to lay your quilt on the angle. Okay, so that's good and straight. And I'm going to take that seam allowance and I'm going to fold it back on itself. And you can feel right here that those two seam allowances are laying right on top of one another. And again, just because it will help keep that out of the way, I'm going to put a pin in. We won't be sewing there, but it'll help keep that out of our way. All right, so now here comes the magic. We'll see if our lines line up today. So I usually start one fairly close to where the thread stops, and I'm going to put it through on the front, and now you're going to see if it's on the line on the back, and you can see I'm off a little bit, so I'm just going to take this top one loose and move my needle over until we hit that line. Okay. So that's a positioning pin, so I need another pin to go in right next to that, so that way I'm keeping my pin right, and I have, if you look at my finger underneath, you see how I'm holding that pin so that it's right straight up and down? Okay, so now I can pull that out, Try to do one here in the middle. Okay, and then I always do a third one that we get out here on the edge a little further. You know, sometimes it'll go right straight through, and I think it might be how you hold your mouth, maybe. I'm not sure. Okay, so now I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine. And again, I'm going to mark right here where the thread starts. And that just is a visual, it just helps you, it's a little easier to put your needle right where you need it. And so you can see, if you're looking at it here with me, I've got that spot right there. And again, I'll use the flywheel to put the needle down right on that spot. And now I'm just going to sew on the line. Okay, so now the first thing that you want to do before you do any pressing is you want to open up you want to do it from the top. You're going to open it up because what you don't want to happen, I'm going to open this up on the back side too so it'll lay flat. But what you don't want, and the reason I start here in the center, is that you don't want to have a hole there. And that's real easy to do, especially if you start from the corner and go into the center. Sometimes it's real easy to have that hole. So by starting where we did, you can see that I put it right where those two seams came together. And now I'm ready to take this to the iron and press it. And the first thing I do is I'm going to press it from the back side. So now again, I'm going to take a look at it. We'll press it good from the front. And now it looks good. So now I can come back and I can trim off this excess fabric. And now we're just going to cut it and trim it so that we have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance there. And I haven't trimmed any of these. I haven't done that one yet. I'll go ahead and trim the other two that I've done here. If you're not used to using a rotary cutter, I hope that you've been noticing that every time I quit using this rotary cutter, I pull the blade cover back so that you don't accidentally lay it down and put a piece of fabric over it and take your hand and sweep across it. It's a good habit. So, okay, I'm going to unlock it. I'm going to do my trimming. Lock it. If you just get in that habit, you will save yourself from any kind of injury that you might get from having an open rotary cutter blade. Okay, I have one more corner to do, and I'll do that, and we're going to let you listen to a brief word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Nine Patch Fabrics has a wide variety of fabric, patterns, and notions. We offer quilt store quality fabric from manufacturers such as Moda, Robert Kaufman, Island Batik, and more. Nine Patch Fabrics also features a variety of notions, including creative grids, rulers, sew line marking tools, and more. Visit Nine Patch Fabrics at ninepatchfabrics.com.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's Tables are made in the USA.
Okay, now you can see I have pinned all my flowers onto my quilt block. And this is the point that you need to decide, are you going to quilt it by hand or are you going to quilt it by machine? If you're going to quilt it by machine, my quilter will tell you, don't put the flowers on yet, wait till it's quilted. But if you're going to quilt it by hand, you certainly can go ahead and do that. Now, you'll see that we have 4 large flowers and we have 8 small ones, and I didn't demo the small one for you the other day in the other class, but I want to show you, you do it exactly the same way. You're going to turn over from one point to the next point and do your basting. And then when you get ready to pull it up, I just put 2 fingers inside the cap and begin to pull. And you'll want to just spread those gathers around the edge and then just do another little tug. Now, this needs to end up 1.5 inches across. And I find if I measured my fingers and 2 fingers in here is just about 1.5 inches. And so I've pulled it up. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knot off my thread. And to do that, I've rethreaded the piece of thread from my basting. And I'm just going to come on the inside here in the turnover part. And I'm going to take several stitches, and you can see I've made a loop with my thread, so I'm going to come up in the middle of that loop, which will help me tie a knot there. And I'm going to do that again, just make a loop, take another stitch and come up in the loop. And so now I have that all done, and I'm just going to take my needle out. And this is the fun part. I'm going to just make sure that I have my gathers spread out around the edge. And so now, just like on the big one, we're going to pinch right here in the top. And I'm going to twist the base. And so you can see by doing that twist like we do, here, let me put my pin down here. Twist the base, and now I'm just going to hold that in my fingers while I slide a pin right through those gathers from one side to the other. And there you go. So now when you get ready to sew this on your quilt, you can take your stitches, leave that pin in there until you get it all sewn on, because it will help you hold those stitches. And we're going to take some stitches around the outside perimeter, and we're going to take some in the folds here in the center. And so there you go with your rows that's just starting to unfurl. All right, now let's talk a little bit. Oh, I have one more thing I want to show you having to do with that. And this is the 8th one, and so that one's going to go right there on my quilt. And we'll just get that pinned in place, and now I have all 8 of the little ones on there. Now, I told you when we made the flowers that you could make this into a pin. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't use very much felt, because I suggested that you put felt on the back of it. But the other thing you could do is I made a yo-yo. And just pull the yo-yo up, and you'll put the raw edges here on the back. And now you can tack up and down in the folds to hold those all together. And then if you put a pin back right here on the back of that yo-yo, you have a pretty little pin. And wouldn't that just look real pretty on a dress? And you made it all out of one 7-inch circle of fabric. And the yo-yo, I used a 3-inch circle. And then I didn't turn it under, I just basted around the edge and pulled it up. So there you go. You could make some little boutonnieres or corsages. You could do the little one exactly the same way if you wanted to use it for a little boutonniere type design. So now once we've decided whether or not we're going to sew the flowers on, the next step would be to make a quilt sandwich. And a quilt sandwich is the quilt top, a layer of batting, and a backing. And I will just tell you that you want to use as good a quality of fabric on the back of your quilt as you use on the front of the quilt so that they would wear equally. And I brought in a cotton batting today. I'm not going to do that. If you haven't done a quilt sandwich, I would suggest that you go back to class 1, which was the 9-patch project that we did, because we did a whole lesson on making the quilt sandwich. When you get ready to put the binding on your quilt, I'm going to bind my quilt in the same fabric that I used for this outside border. And I like to cut my binding 2 1/4 inches. That will end up with like about a nice 3/8 inch binding on the edge of your quilt. And that's exactly what I did on the red and white quilt that you see here. 2 1/4 inches. Sometimes people will say to cut it 2 1/2 inches, and then you don't like how wide it is on the front, so people pull it to the back. That just creates one more wear spot, one where it ends on the front and one where it ends on the back. So 2 1/4 inches is a good size to cut that batting. I thank you for joining me. I hope that as you progress and work on your quilt, that you will post pictures on the AQS Facebook page. That's AQS Online is the name on Facebook. And don't forget to go register for those prizes. Our sponsors, who we thank, all of our sponsors: Bernina of America, 9-Patch Fabrics, Panasonic Cordless Irons, Tracy's Tables, Vivalux with the lamps, and YLI with our thread. We thank all of them for providing the prizes that some of you are going to win. Bernina of America has been a sponsor of the sewing machine that we use in our classes, and I am a Bernina brand ambassador, which means that if you buy a Bernina sewing machine between the start of this class to 30 days after this class ends, which is from July 6th to September 10th, you can request a coupon from me for a $100 rebate on that sewing machine. And it's all handled through Bernina. It doesn't have anything to do with your dealer, but you will find the information to request that rebate coupon from me in the description of this class. So with that, thank you again for joining me, and be sure to check out Quilt TV on YouTube. That's where all of these classes permanently stay, and there's thousands of videos out there for you to see. This is our 5th class now in the AQS Let's Quilt series, but there are many more interviews, quilt exhibits that you can look through. You could spend a lot of time on Quilt TV on YouTube. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe, because then every time we post a new video, you will get a notice that there's a new video out there on Quilt TV. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon in another AQS Let's Quilt class.